66-yard touchdown. Jamar Jefferson on his way, and that's a touchdown for the Lions.
To the end zone, Diggs has it. Touchdown.
Caught by Devontae Smith for the touchdown. Darius Slay on the move to the outside. Walker's in front of him. Slay all by himself down the field.
Mahomes, turn of time, escapes, goes to the end zone. It's Williams there, and he makes the grab.
Welcome in, everyone, to the Lucky Shots podcast. This is the fantasy show, and what a week. You had so many things happen. It's still the NFL of upsets, crazy things happening. And when we jump into Fantasy Kings, we're going to see one of the biggest things that happened this week. So without further ado, let's hop right into the Fantasy Kings from last week. So at quarterback, we had Patrick Mahomes. He had 36.24 fantasy points, 406 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Exactly what you drafted Patrick Mahomes expecting him to do, and finally he does it this week. And the Chiefs look like their old selves. And just right over at running back, another Chief, Darrell Williams, had 29.4 fantasy points, 43 rushing yards, 9 receptions for 101 yards and a touchdown. He has been huge, and I imagine that he's going to probably keep a big part of that starting role for the Chiefs, even when Clyde Edwards-Helaire comes back. And then we're going to go down to tight end because this is also a Kansas City Chief. Travis Kelce had 19.9 fantasy points. He had 10 targets, 8 receptions, 119 yards. So the Kansas City Chiefs, just insane. Even in the best of the rest wide receivers, you got a Kansas City wide receiver down there. So they just littered the top 5 with players this week. And now they're going into a big game next week where if they play the way that they did this week against the Raiders, it's going to look just as good. And then finishing off the Fantasy Kings, we had DEEBO Samuel. 30.3 fantasy points. He had 5 targets, 5 receptions, 97 yards and a touchdown. He also had 36 rushing yards and a touchdown on the ground. Huge game for DEEBO. In my fantasy matchup, he actually would have won me the week had the guy I was playing not blocked out some of his points by picking up San Francisco's quarterback. So very heady play right there. Very smart for him. But DEEBO, huge game, and just being utilized in so many different ways. It's just a lot of fun to watch and very good to see. Now moving on to the best of the rest quarterbacks. We had at the number 2 quarterback spot, Dak Prescott. He had 26.34 fantasy points, 296 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 5 rushing yards, and a touchdown on the ground. And the interesting part is the top 2 fantasy quarterbacks from this week are facing off next week. That's going to be a fun game to watch. We previewed it yesterday on the Game Day show, and if you haven't watched that, you can, backtrack and go watch that show. But Dak Prescott looked really good. Patrick Mahomes looked really good. So both these offenses, I think, are just going to clash and make fireworks. It's just going to be fun, or a good thing to watch. At the number 3 quarterback spot, we had Josh Allen, 20.94 fantasy points. He had 366 yards passing, 2 touchdowns and an interception. Big performance for their bounce back, and he should try to carry it over into next week as well. At the number 3 spot, at the number 4 spot, Mac Jones had 19.92 fantasy points, only 198 passing yards, but 3 touchdowns. And, like I have said a few times, he's just being consistent, being, how do I want to say it, efficient with the football. He is playing well, being smart, not putting the Patriots in bad positions, and it's paying off. The team's winning, he's playing well, and when he plays well, it complements their run game as well. So good to see Mac Jones getting up here into these top ranks for quarterback. And then at number 5, Trevor Siemian. He had 19.92 fantasy points, 298 passing yards, and 2 touchdowns. New Orleans, hopefully you can continue to get production like that out of Trevor Siemian, because you can't ask for much more than that. He's not turning the ball over. He's throwing for almost 300 yards. He's getting you a couple touchdowns. You got to kind of build around him, make things work out, because he is performing pretty decent, especially for being a backup. For your best running backs, we have Ramondre Stevenson at number 2. He had 27.4 fantasy points, 100 rushing yards, and 2 touchdowns. He also had 4 catches for 14 yards. At number 3, we had A.J. Dillon, 66 rush yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 receptions for 62 yards, giving him 26.8 fantasy points. And the thing about A.J. Dillon is he's probably going to start this next week as well. So he's going to be somebody to watch, and we'll talk about it a little later, but he could have a good opportunity to have a huge week, another huge week. At number 4, we have Christian McCaffrey, 26.1. He had 95 rushing yards, 10 catches for 66 yards. It's easy to say C-Mac is back. They have Cam Newton now, who is more than likely going to start next week, so get ready to see a lot more Christian McCaffrey in these top 5s. Then at number 5, we had Jonathan Taylor, 24.6 fantasy points. He had 116 rushing yards, a touchdown, and 6 catches for 10 yards. That was a weird stat to me. He had 6 catches, but only 10 yards. Interesting. Moving on to our best wide receivers, we had Stephon Diggs at number 2. He had 30.2 fantasy points, 13 targets, 8 receptions, 162 yards, and a touchdown. Very nice. One of my fantasy teams has DEEBO Samuel, and it has Stephon Diggs. So I had the top 1 and the top 2 wide receivers this week on one of my fantasy teams. And then if we go down one player, number 3 is CeeDee Lamb. 28.6 fantasy points. He had 7 targets, 6 receptions, 94 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 12 rushing yards. And then my other fantasy squad has DEEBO Samuel and CeeDee Lamb. Nice thing about that league, I had the number 1 and number 3 receiver, but I also lost. So I'm 3-7 in that league. It's not looking good. At number 4, we had Tyreek Hill, 27.5 fantasy points. He had 10 targets, 7 receptions, 83 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 rushing yards. Again, Kansas City just putting up all of the fantasy points this week and making Vegas look like chumps. And at number 5, Kendrick Bourne. He had 24.1 fantasy points. He was very involved on either facet of football or the offense this week. He had 4 targets, 4 receptions, 98 yards, a touchdown, and 43 rushing yards. A lot of these guys had rushing yards this week at that wide receiver position, so interesting to see. Then at the tight end, best of the rest tight ends, we had number 2, Hunter Henry. He had 4 targets, 4 catches, 37 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 19.7 fantasy points. Looks like he's becoming, a big part of the Patriots passing game, so he might be somebody to jump on here pretty quick. At number 3, Mark Andrews had 8 8 targets, 6 receptions, 63 yards, and a touchdown for 18.3 fantasy points. Then Tyler Conklin, he had 5 targets, 3 receptions, 11 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 16.1 fantasy points. So basically, he just pulled a Mike Evans, caught a couple touchdown passes, and it was a good fantasy week for him. And at number 5, George Kittle for the second straight week, getting up into the top 5, coming off of an injury. But he had 7 targets, 5 receptions, 50 yards, a touchdown for 16 fantasy points. All right, so before we hop into, what's this next week going to look like, we do have 2 teams on a bye. You got the Rams, so that effectively takes out Matt Stafford, Cooper Kupp, Tyler Higbee, Darrell Henderson Jr., Van Jefferson, Odell Beckham Jr. Takes all those guys out, so you will have to, find something to replace them with. Hopefully you have prepared for that beforehand and you got people to put in instead. And then the Broncos, you got Noah Fant, Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, Tim Patrick, Devontae Williams, Melvin Gordon. So those are pieces that are less worrisome that you're trying to replace. But if you're like me and you have even Javonte Williams, that's honestly like one of my best running backs because I don't have very good running backs. And Cordero Patterson also possibly being hurt for this week. I'm in a tough spot. So hopefully you can go to your waiver wire or you have prepared for this and you're ready for those guys to be out. All right, so let's move on to the quarterback position next week. We've got it split into top quarterbacks, boom or bust, and wild cards for all these positions. So who are going to be these top quarterbacks? Who can we expect to be at the top of the list next week for this position? Well, first you got Patrick Mahomes. He's projected 22.2 fantasy points. He's going up against Dallas, who's ranked 12th against the quarterback position. And last week, he had 400 yards, 5 touchdowns. Dallas, they are susceptible to giving away fantasy points to quarterbacks. 12th, they've really, brought that number down. So that's a good thing. But Patrick Mahomes, if, he can keep up what he's been doing, well, I guess not what he's been doing, what he did last game, then it's going to be a good week for him. But again, hedge your bets on Kansas City. Just plug your nose and hope it works. And then in that same matchup, Dak Prescott, he's going up against Kansas City, who is actually 31st against quarterbacks. He's projected 21.9. So I expect a big week from, Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, Dalton Schultz. It should be a very, very big week for them. And, Prescott coming off of a top 5 fantasy quarterback finish. Gotta be excited what you may see there. Then you got Tom Brady going up against the Giants, who are 15th against the quarterback position, projected 21.7 fantasy points. He didn't have a great week last week. Tampa Bay lost. This is another game where it can just be a huge letdown. But I think Brady is going to turn it around. He's going to have a huge bounce-back game, especially against the Giants, who, sometimes are good, sometimes are not. It's, Tom Brady, and it's the Buccaneers offense that has a lot of people in it that, you can be confident in starting every single week. So I'm going with Brady there. Then we got Kyler Murray, 14th, going up against 14th ranked Seattle against the quarterback. He's projected 18.9. Still not completely cleared for Sunday. And I know that I sat here and I talked about, okay, I think he's going to be back next week or this week, and yada, yada. And he didn't play. there's still a possibility he doesn't play this week, but if he does, I like the matchup against Seattle. I like that Arizona's going to have to bounce back off of a loss, so I think it's going to be a good game for Kyler Murray if he is in. And then for that 5th spot, I think Joe Burrow. He's going up against Vegas, who is 18th against the quarterback. He's projected 18.6, and he's another one where it's got to be a bounce-back week. And he's going against Vegas, who just gave up 400 yards and 5 touchdowns to Pat Mahomes. So it should be a good week for Burrow. Moving on to the boom or bust candidates. Top 1, Lamar Jackson. So, Lamar should have a big week. He's projected 25 points. He's going against Chicago, who's 19th against fantasy quarterbacks. But he's coming off the week against Miami. Wasn't a good week. The whole team, coming off that loss. Chicago is a team that is just starting to really make things competitive. So, is Lamar going to go out there and have a 40-point game because he is just running all over, throwing the ball all over, or is it going to be a game like last week where they just bum rush him, he can't complete a pass, he can't get any running going, so it's going to be either or. I don't think there's going to be a middle spot for Lamar this week. Then we have Tua Tagovailoa. He's going against the Jets, who are ranked 24th against the quarterback position. He's projected 20.3, and I am confident in Tua this week. I think he could do very well. I've been sitting here thinking maybe I'm going to go get Tua and start him over Justin Herbert even. The matchup is good. He's been playing decent, and he's been scoring fantasy points. He's projected 20.3. And it's against the Jets. The Jets just aren't very good against quarterbacks, so he's either going to go out and have you a top 5 week, or he's not going to crack the top 10, 15. Then we have Jalen Hurts. 19.7 is what he's projected. He's going against New Orleans, who's 11th against quarterbacks. We saw him last week have a really good week. I don't believe he was in the top 5 at all, but it was still a good week. He went out there, put out 30 points on the Broncos, but he's going against New Orleans. New Orleans, they're a team that sometimes gets the job done, sometimes doesn't, but, Hurts, his abilities against a team like New Orleans, you kind of trust their defense because they've won games that they shouldn't and been in pretty close games that they shouldn't. So New Orleans is kind of tough to gauge. But Jalen Hurts is projected 19.7. He had a good week against the Broncos, probably building off that momentum. So he's either going to be a boom or a bust this week. And then a guy who's really a boom or bust every week is Ryan Tannehill. The reason I put him in boom or bust instead of maybe top quarterbacks is because he's going against Houston, who's 23rd against the quarterback, but they're just not a good team overall. Tannehill is projected 18.9, and the reason he's in this category is because are they going to be throwing the ball a lot? Or are they going to get up early, start running the ball? Tannehill is going to become less of a factor and bust? Or, is he going to have some big-time throws? They're going to be throwing, quite a bit, and he gets quite a few points. I'm not sure which way that one's going to go. And then rounding out the boom or bust, we have Cam Newton. He had 2 touchdowns last week. Wasn't even the starting quarterback. Threw the ball like 4 times. Ran it a couple times, but projected to be the starter this week. He's projected 17.4 fantasy points, but he's going against Washington, who's 32nd against the quarterback. Now, I know we just saw Washington last week go out and take down Tom Brady, but they don't have Chase Young. They're regardless of what happened last week, they're still last against fantasy quarterbacks. And Cam poses different threats than Brady did, and with no Chase Young, they're not going to be able to get as much pressure on Cam to make things happen. And then we will go to the wild card spot. We've got Justin Herbert going up against Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is 8th against quarterbacks, and Herbert's projected 19.2. So one, it's a wild card because Pittsburgh got a pretty good defense. Could just stop them on their own. Justin Herbert is a wild card in his own right because you never know how a game's going to go. And most of the time, it hasn't really been a bust week. It's been right down the middle, but it's just not what you expect, what you need from Justin Herbert, because he's got the chance to boom. He's been the top quarterback a couple weeks before, but he's also sat at the bottom of the heap because he's not producing. He's getting one touchdown, but canceling it out with an interception, getting only a couple, maybe 190 yards. It's been very infuriating. I have him across every single league. So it's been a tough ride this season, but against Pittsburgh, there's a chance. So you just never know what to expect with Herbert. You got Derek Carr. He's going up against the Bengals. They're 16th against quarterbacks. He's projected 18.3. The Bengals aren't great against quarterbacks, but Derek Carr has also been an up and down quarterback. He just had a real bad week against Kansas City. He's had a couple of those, but he's also had weeks where he's very, very good. And then you just saw with Cincinnati a couple weeks ago, they just let, Cleveland, run all over him. So it's going to be tough. But Derek Carr does have a good chance to go out against Cincinnati and put up some points in a game that could be a shootout. Who knows? Then you got Kirk Cousins, who is just the ultimate wild card. He's going up against Green Bay, who is 7th against quarterbacks. He's projected 16.4. And regardless of how this game goes, there's just going to be a lot of garbage time, I'm imagining, for Kirk Cousins to go out and get points. But it could also, there's that great possibility it could be close and Cousins doesn't score as much. And Green Bay's got a stiff defense, and they don't really allow teams to do a whole lot. And with the addition of Aaron Rodgers coming back, they also control the ball offensively. So we don't know what we're going to see from Kirk Cousins, but it could be a lot of garbage time. Then you got Mac Jones going against Atlanta, who's 30th against quarterbacks. He's projected 16.1. Obviously, we saw a top 5 performance from him last week, but we only saw about 200 yards passing. But it's all been consistent. So is it going to be a good fantasy week, or is it just going to be a good football week for Mac Jones going against Atlanta? This is a game I expect them to win, but I think it's going to be a lot of ground game and not a lot of Mac Jones making things happen. And then to round it out, we have Jimmy Garoppolo going up against Jacksonville. Who's ranked 17th against the quarterback. He's projected 15.8 fantasy points. Jacksonville, that's a great matchup. Garoppolo just had a decent enough week last week against the Rams. So this is a game where they should get out early. They should get out often. And it should be fun to watch. But is Garoppolo going to be the guy who's going out and putting up 25, maybe 30 points? There's a possibility because it's Jacksonville, but I don't see that happening. And then we'll move on to the top running backs. Said it at the top of the show, Christian McCaffrey's back, and he's just going to continue to be a top running back. Going against Washington, who is 12th against that position. He's projected 23.8, so obviously, we've seen it 2 weeks from him now. The first week, 50 yards through the air, 50 yards on the ground, looked good. This past week, 10 catches and almost 100 yards rushing. So he's just back to his old ways, and he's gonna start winning people fantasy championships. And if they've been down and out because he's been down and out, they're gonna make a huge comeback these next few weeks. Then we have Najee Harris. He's going up against the Chargers. Who is ranked 22nd against the running back position. He's projected 21 points. We just saw Darrell Williams, who in all reality is a backup running back, go off for the top running back spot last week. But that wasn't against the Chargers. Don't know what I'm talking about. We saw Dalvin Cook go out. There we go. And pick up a touchdown and go out and have a decent game. Najee Harris has just become the center point of this offense, and I don't see that changing against the Chargers, who aren't very good against running backs as is. So I think it's going to be a huge week for Najee. Then we've got Alvin Kamara. He's going against Philly, who is ranked 26th against the running back position. He's projected 19 points. There is a good chance that he may not even be in this week, but I highly doubt it. I think it was COVID that kept him out. And Kamara should just be he should have a huge week. Ingram last week had a great week. They're going up against Philly. Philly gave up, a decent amount to the running back position against Denver last week, and they just do overall. So I think it's going to be a good week for Kamara, and if not, maybe Ingram plugs back in and has a good week. Then we got James Conner. He's going against Seattle, who's ranked 31st against running backs. He's projected 17.6. He may not have popped up in the top 5 last week, but he still had a touchdown, still went out, put up some points for you. It wasn't, a huge game, but it was also just a weird game for Arizona where they lost. But James Conner, I think you're going to be okay with putting him up against Seattle's defense that is just not good against running backs. So should be a good week for James Conner. And then we got Nick Chubb. Obviously, he's going to be a top running back. I mean, it was COVID that kept him out. No more COVID. He's going to have Detroit coming back. They're 27th against the running backs. He's projected 17.5. And if we look at his last game, it was a top 5 fantasy finish. And going up against Detroit, who's just not good, I think Nick Chubb has a huge possibility of being that top running back this coming week. Then for our boomer bust candidates, we have Austin Eckler going up against Pittsburgh, who is ranked 5th. He's projected 18.8. Eckler's coming off of a bad week, going into a week against a team that is pretty good against running backs, but still Austin Eckler. And, bad week or not, he's coming into this week against a good opponent, projected 18.8 fantasy points. I still think that you can believe in Austin Eckler, but there is that chance going up against a good team off of a bad week. Eckler could end up being a bust this week, but they could also have to use him quite a bit. He could be a boom. That could be a good thing for you. Then we've got DeAndre Swift going against Cleveland, who is 11th against the running back. He's projected 18.3. I'm pretty confident in Swift myself, but the fact that he's going up against Cleveland, who, can have a really good run defense, and they know that he's a main focal point, they could focus on him, and that could make him a bust. But if he gets the volume he did last week and can produce with it and get in the end zone, he's going to have a boom week. So I like DeAndre Swift this week, but again, if Cleveland, with their pretty good defense, goes out and decides, we're going to make it a focus to stop him, then he could bust. Then we have A.J. Dillon. He's going up against Minnesota, who's ranked 18th. He's projected 17 points, and he's just a boomer bust because last week we saw him boom. And, it was great. He had a couple touchdowns. He's going up against Minnesota, who's not very good. But how much of the game plan is going to involve him? Are they going to pound the ground and run A.J. Dillon all day? Or are they going to, be in a close game because it is Minnesota and he gets kind of phased out and they're throwing the ball more? I think they're going to use him plenty. So I think he's going to boom, but, if this game goes a different direction, it says very well he could only get, 5-6 points. Then moving on, we have Myles Gaskin. He's going up against the Jets, who are ranked 32nd against running backs. He's projected 16 points. And, Gaskin, he's been another one that's been either boom or bust. It's been mostly bust. But going up against the Jets, who are dead last against running backs, he's got a good projection. And we've seen, at least a few weeks where he can have that top quarterback or top running back performance. So he's either going to have a huge week or he's not going to have much of anything. I don't see an in between for Myles Gaskin either. And then we have Michael Carter. He's going up against Miami, who's 13th against the running back position. He's projected 15.3. He's kind of like Gaskin, but he's been more of a steady rise into a good role for the Jets. And, he's become a key contributor, honestly, to this offense. They're not all that great of an offense, but, him, Elijah Moore, it's been, a lot of young guys stepping up and making plays. So I think Michael Carter, he's got a chance to have a big week. But if not, the game plan could just go in a different direction. Then moving on to our wild card picks, all good running backs. It's just their matchup is weird and going to be tough for them to overcome, I think. We'll start out with Dalvin Cook. He's going up against Green Bay, who is 9th against running backs. He is projected 18.3. He did have a touchdown, I believe, last week. It's just going to be, the question of what is the game plan going to be, kind of like with A.J. Dillon in the same game. How is the game going to go, and how involved is Dalvin Cook going to be? Because there's sometimes he gets kind of involved in the pass game, but most of the time not. So how much is he going to get to run the ball? How much is he going to touch the ball if Green Bay gets a lead? But it could be a good week for him as well if, he goes and gets into the end zone or breaks off a big run, which he is also capable of doing. Then we got Jonathan Taylor going up against Buffalo, who has the first-ranked defense against fantasy running backs. He's projected 17.5, and he's had, plenty of weeks now in a row where he's got a lot of yards, he's got touchdowns, he's one of the top backs in the league. But going against Buffalo is going to be a very tough test. Buffalo doesn't give up a lot on the ground, so what is his role going to be? We know that either way he's going to be running quite a bit, but how much of the passing game is he going to be involved in? Is he going to get touchdowns? Is he going to break off a big run? Stuff like that. Just don't know against Buffalo's defense. Then you have Zeke Elliott going up against Kansas City. They're 21st against the running back position. He's projected 17 points. But again, Zeke is a guy who either has a good game or doesn't. But the past few weeks, subtract the games he's done very well, they've all been kind of middle of the pack games. So what can we expect from him this week? Against Kansas City, it should be decent. We didn't see a whole lot from the running back position last week for the Raiders, but Zeke is a much better running back, I think, than Jacobs or Kenyon Drake. He's in an offense where he can be heavily involved. He could catch passes out of the backfield. He could, at some point, have, a big run. Could get in the end zone. So it's a week where you just don't know, again, how that game plan is going to go. So Zeke could be a wild card this week. Then you have James Robinson against San Francisco. San Francisco, they're ranked 16th against the run. He is projected 16.2, and obviously he's the best player on their team. So you would expect him to have a good week, but what can San Francisco do against them? Darrell Henderson last week against the 49ers didn't have really all that big of a week, but LA was also having to throw the ball a lot. So if the Jaguars, who presumably will be in the same position, get in that position, how is James Robinson going to be used? And then Joe Mixon against the Raiders. The Raiders are 24th against running backs. He's projected 15.8. And honestly, I would expect a huge week out of Joe Mixon. We just saw Darrell Williams go off for the top running back spot against this Raiders team. And I expect Joe Mixon to do that. Joe Mixon, honestly, is a better running back than Darrell Williams. But Joe Mixon sometimes does or does not get involved. So it just depends on what the offense is going to do again. But I think Mixon, he's in this wild card spot, but he could easily be over in that top running back spot. So I guess we'll just have to see there. Moving on to the wide receivers. Our top wide receivers are going to start out with Tyreek Hill, going up against Dallas, who's 20th against fantasy wide receivers. Tyreek's projected 20.9. He was just up into the top 5 for receivers last week. A couple weeks back, he had like 18 targets. This offense is starting to look good. So we just kind of have to say we're going to trust in this offense. We saw it last week. Let's hopefully see it again. The week after, a big week. Hopefully they can put something else together. And up against Dallas, who is middle of the pack when it comes to being against fantasy players, I think Tyreek Hill, again, could be one of those top guys. I have Joe Burrow up in the top quarterbacks, so coincidentally, I'm going to have Jamar Chase in the top wide receivers. He's going up against Vegas, who's actually 6th against wide receivers. He's projected 18.2, but it's no secret he is the top target in that offense. He's going to get, at least 7 or 8 targets. He's going to more than likely catch a touchdown, and there could be those big plays. And I expect there to be, we just saw last week, Vegas get tore up by Tyreek Hill, by even McCole Hardman, who had quite a decent game, Travis Kelce. So I just think this is a good week for Jamar Chase to go out and get some points. Then we've got DEEBO. You can't bet against DEEBO, especially when he's going up against Jacksonville, who's 25th against the receiver position. He's projected 18 points. And, if he continues to get involved the way he did last week, and they just continue to use him for so many different things, DEEBO could solidify his spot in the top 5 for the rest of the year. Then we got Justin Jefferson going up against Green Bay. Green Bay is 5th against wide receivers. Jefferson's projected 17.1, but I think regardless of how this game's going to go, Justin Jefferson is just, as a player even, one of the best wide receivers in the league. So regardless of how this game's going, he's going to get a lot of targets, especially if they're down. He's going to get more targets, and they're pretty good at moving him around, getting him into spots where he can get open. And coming off of a big 100-yard game, I think he continues that this week, even though Green Bay is pretty good against wide receivers. Then rounding out the top of the wide receiver core, I think CeeDee Lamb against the Chiefs is also going to have a good game. Kansas City is 9th against wide receivers. He is projected 16.3, but again, he's coming off of a 2-touchdown game. He's really solidifying himself as the top receiver for that team. Even though Kansas City's pretty good against receivers, we've seen weeks where they are very bad at covering wide receivers. And CeeDee Lamb, kind of like Justin Jefferson, is very quick, very agile, and can get open really well and is targeted pretty heavily. So there's honestly no reason to think after a 2-touchdown game he's going to come out, not get those same targets, not get the chances at touchdowns, and have a big week. Boom or bust for wide receivers. Devontae Adams I'm putting up here. Minnesota is only 27th against receivers, so that's a good matchup. He's projected 21.3. But again, if Green Bay gets up early and they're not having to throw the football and they're just running out the clock, we've seen it from Adams a lot this year, actually, is he doesn't get a lot because they don't need to give him a lot. They get up, maybe he gets a touchdown, maybe he gets a few catches, but we haven't really seen that boom week from him. But he is a boom player because, say this game is close. He could go out and have 13, 14 targets, catch a couple touchdowns, and have a huge week for you. But I just don't know how this game's going to go. And we've seen Adams, have less of an impressive game than we would want too many times this year. Then we have A.J. Brown going up against Houston, another good matchup, as Houston's 22nd against wide receivers, and he's projected 16.5 points. But just last week, he only had one catch, hardly any yards. A few weeks before that, he was a boom player. So how do we gauge what A.J. Brown's going to do? He started out the season not so hot, had a few weeks where he was booming every week. Last week, didn't really have a whole lot. Going up against Houston, I would expect him to have a big game, but again, they could get up early. The ball could not go his way, and then all of a sudden you find him phased out of the game, and they're running the clock out, winning that game, and he doesn't get a lot. Then we have Keenan Allen going up against Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's 17th against the wide receiver position. Allen is projected 15.9, but as I kind of talked about with Herbert, Pittsburgh's defense is pretty decent, but this offense also, it's just hard to gauge what they are because some games, Herbert can go out and throw for 300, 400 yards. Keenan Allen has really been coming on as of late, getting a lot of targets, but again, Herbert, if he just throws one touchdown, the probability of it going to Keenan Allen isn't as high as every other person on that offense. So Keenan, could go out and have another big week of 13 targets, but is there going to be a touchdown in there? How many yards is that going to be? So it's just kind of tough to gauge whether or not he's going to be really good or just, mediocre, not very good at all this week. Then we've got Hollywood Brown. Not calling him Marquise anymore. I don't care what happened last week. Hollywood Brown going up against Chicago. Chicago is 28th against wide receivers, and he's projected 15.5. Had last week not been a loss for the Ravens against Miami, easily Hollywood would be up into that top receiving core, in my opinion. But because of last week, it was just tough to figure out this week how they're going to look. It's something that made the game hard to choose for the Ravens this week because they are on such a letdown. What's going to happen? I think that they bounce back, and I think Hollywood has, his big game. I think Lamar possibly has his big game, but they're both in the boom or bust category because they're either both going to connect for a few receptions, a touchdown, maybe a big play, or they're going to have some sort of dud week like they did last week. And then we've got Terry McLaurin going up against Carolina, who is third against receivers. He's projected 14.3. Again, there's a chance Logan Thomas comes back. Carolina is pretty good at defending against the pass, so that's going to be tough as well. I expect Terry to be a boom because he's overly targeted in this offense, which he should be. He's their best receiving option, but last week even didn't have, the kind of week that you would expect or want from Terry McLaurin. Then in the wild cards, we have DK Metcalf going up against Arizona, who is 8th against wide receivers, projected 15.7. Who knows what's going to happen, because last week you would expect, with Russell Wilson back, this offense finally gets back on track. The offense only had like 200 yards, so who knows? And Arizona, honestly, is a better defense than Green Bay. So if Seattle doesn't get it figured out, DK Metcalf could just be non-existent. Then you have Brandon Cooks, who just is a wild card every week. Tennessee's actually 32nd against wide receivers, and Cooks is projected 15.6. Houston's not a good team, but Brandon Cooks is the only bright spot, especially in fantasy. So I expect there to be a lot of targets his way. I expect probably a lot of garbage time to go his way. And I think, he could be up in the top, but also he could just get shut down. The entire Houston team could just not move the ball. And what do you get out of that? You don't get a lot. Mike Evans going up against the Giants, who are 16th against wide receivers. He's projected 15.4. And what more do I need to say with Mike Evans? Who knows what the hell is going to happen? We talk about these receivers every week. Which one is it going to be? Which one's it not going to be? Evans can either catch 2 passes for, 2 touchdowns, or he can catch 6 balls, no touchdowns, maybe, 80 yards. Either way, that couldn't just leave him right in the middle of the pack. And if they have AB back this week, which who knows if they will. I don't think they will, but you never know. Then that just adds one more obstacle for Mike Evans, and then you're just throwing up a triple-sided coin and seeing which head it falls on. Then you got Jalen Waddle going against the Jets. The Jets are projected are 18th against wide receivers, and Jalen Waddle is projected 15.1. Waddle's really becoming a huge target for Tua or any quarterback for Miami. He's been getting targeted quite a bit and could have a big game. But is there going to be a touchdown? Is there going to be more than 5 receptions? Is it going to maybe be a 100-yard game? Or is it just going to be all right down the middle and he gets maybe 10 to 15 points? That's the question. Going against the Jets, you would expect there to be more points for him, but you never know. And then you have DJ Moore going up against Washington, who is 31st against wide receivers. He's projected 14.4. He's a wild card because what is this offense going to look like with Cam Newton? What's it going to look like against a Washington defense that just, shut down Tampa Bay? I mean, it's hard to gauge. DJ Moore is the better of the wide receivers on that team, but how much is he going to get with Christian McCaffrey now having 10 receptions last week? I mean, you hope that DJ Moore gets back on the board and starts, becoming a part of this offense. But again, what's going to happen with Cam Newton? We don't know. And then finishing up with your top tight ends, we've got Travis Kelce, obviously, going up against Dallas. Who is ranked 19th against the tight end position. He's projected 17.3. We're just going to whip through these because obviously these are the top guys, and it's what we started out with tight end-wise for the top guys this past season. Darren Waller against Cincinnati, who is 10th against wide receiver or tight ends. He's projected 14.7, and then George Kittle, who's had a big last 2 weeks, going up against Jacksonville, who is 22nd. He's projected 14.1. All of those guys I expect, especially with their matchups, the way that they're being targeted, they're going to be the top 3 guys this next week. And, maybe there's some guys in the boom or bust category that overtake one of them in that top 5, but I don't see that happening. Because you got Mark Andrews in the boom or bust, who's against Chicago, ranked 3rd against the tight end position, and he's only projected 13.9. I mean, he's just in the same category with the rest of the Ravens. What the hell are they going to do after losing to Miami? It's yet to be seen. Kyle Pitts going up against New England, who is ranked 2nd against the tight end position. He's projected 12.6. Pitts has become the number 1 target, but there's no Calvin Ridley. There's really no one to take any attention off of him. So now defenses are just throwing all they got at him, and Matt Ryan's having to find other places, other options. So especially with New England being really good against the tight end position, all that extra help towards him could make it a very tough week. But if he can get open, get 8 catches, get a touchdown, which he's done before, get 100 yards, then this could be a huge week for him, and he is going to have to make something happen because the Falcons are really hurting for anyone to be a playmaker right now. Then you got Mike Gesicki going up against the Jets, who are 21st against tight ends. He's projected 12. he's in the boom or bust because literally last week he had a decent amount of targets but no catches, nothing. In a win against Baltimore, he had 0 points, but he's also had weeks inside the top 5. So against the Jets, you would expect him to be up in that top 5, but he could also throw up a goose, which not a lot of tight ends so far this year have done. Then you got Dallas Goedert going against New Orleans, who is 9th against tight ends. He's projected 11. I think his projection actually went up. I was looking because I've got him in 2 different leagues, and his projection went up from yesterday. So I'm not honestly sure what his projection actually is, and I'm not sure why it went up. But he's always one that can either get you a solid 15 points at that tight end position, or last week he can get you, 5 points. So boom or bust, he is almost the definition of it so far at that tight end position. And then you got TJ Hawkinsox. He's going up against Cleveland, who is 14th against the tight end position. He is projected 10.7. He's also been a guy who, he's one of the best playmakers on the offense, but every once in a while he just doesn't show up. So is this going to be a week where he does show up, where he doesn't? I would expect him to against a Cleveland defense that is going to shut down everything else. But he is a little bit like Kyle Pitts. They could just start throwing the kitchen sink at him and he doesn't see anything. Moving on to the wild cards for your tight end position, you have Pat Freiermuth going up against the Chargers, who's 29th against tight ends. He's projected 10.7. Who knows? Who knows what the Muth is going to do? He had like 3 really big weeks, and then last week was nothing. I mean, yes, they had Kyle Rudolph, or Mason Rudolph, whatever the hell that quarterback's name is. But if Ben's back, possibly he gets back on track. But he also fumbled last week, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with him this week. Then we got Dan Arnold going up against San Francisco, who is 8th against the tight end position. He is projected 10.3, and since going to Jacksonville, he's become pretty much the top target. He is a hot waiver wire pickup because he just gets a lot of targets, gets those catches, and puts together about a 10-point performance every game. But if he can get a touchdown, he can go from just middle of the pack to being one of these top guys. The wild card portion of it is he going to do that? And then you got Dalton Schultz going up against Kansas City, who's 26th against the tight end position. He's projected 9.5. But Schultz, again, you would have expected last week where the Dallas offense scored 43 points for him to be more involved, and he wasn't. He had, I think, 2 or 3 catches. And he's been a model of consistency for most of the season, and then last week didn't do a whole lot. So he's a wild card. What is he going to be back into that 6 to 7 targets / catches this week, or is he going to be phased out, not really catch a whole lot this week? And then you got Tyler Conklin going up against 18th ranked Green Bay. He's projected 9.4. He's a wild card because, he honestly should be in the boom or bust category because he's either going to catch 2 touchdowns or he's not, and that's going to be the points that you get out of him. He could possibly see more targets because of how reliable he was last week, and going up against Green Bay, who, is going to probably have a lot of things shut down. He could be an easy check down all game and end up being a pretty good fantasy option. And then at number 5, rounding out this wild card, you have Hunter Henry, who is going up against Atlanta, 15th against the tight end position. He's projected 7.7, but again, last week he caught 2 touchdown passes, and he's been, really finding a groove, kind of like he did with the Chargers last year at this same time, kind of finding a groove, and, the quarterbacks are figuring out, hey, this guy's actually a pretty good target, let's get him the ball. He's projected not very high, but I could see him, because of the way the Patriots play football. Mac Jones isn't going to throw for a lot of yards, and they're going to run their way all the way down into the red zone, and then that could be Hunter Henry time. but it also could not. So, tough to gauge there, but I think Hunter Henry, you know, he's got as good of a chance as anybody else to go out and actually do something this week. All right, so that's going to do it for the fantasy show. I want to thank you all for joining. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow. We will have Dylan Corbett on the show. He's going to go over all the betting analysis with us, and, you know, we're going to both throw some picks at each other, see what sticks, what we like, maybe catch some DFS, and then, of course, you got to catch our prop bets, which, of course, you can find those polls on Twitter as well after the show releases. So don't forget to tune in for that. Thanks for joining today, and good luck this week. Hopefully, you know, if you're on the bubble of that playoffs, you can start making a run this week. I know I need to do that in one league, so good luck. Have a good week, and we'll see you tomorrow.